All right. So we got 22 people so far. Let's see if it grows. But I think if you want to unmute yourself and tell me that I'm not making any sense and ask a question, that's fine. Because 22 isn't a terrible number, as long as nobody abuses those privileges. Then I think I'll get started. So my name's Jonathan Pyle. I'm the developer of Docassemble. And Docacon is kicking off right now. Big thanks to Quentin, who is here as my co-host, who is going to be doing the beginner training tomorrow and does lots of work in the Docassemble area. And I also want to thank the original sponsors of Docacon. Although we ended up not having any expenses, these folks did step up to sponsor what would have been a fun event in a very hot state in the United States. Catherine Bamford over in the UK agreed to sponsor, and Community Lawyer and Documate also agreed. So big thanks to them. So I'm going to get started with a presentation. There will be some interactive stuff. So to prepare for the interactive stuff, you should join the Docassemble Advanced channel on Slack, where I will post some things that you can copy and paste, and where you can post some things. And also you'll need to use your playground at some point. So you can open that up. I assume everybody has access to a Docassemble server. If you don't, we do have a temporary training server. And if you send a message to Quentin, he can go into I made him an admin on that server, so he can invite you. The link to this presentation, if you wanted to look at it, is that short link on this page. All right, so I'm going to start by giving you an analogy to demonstrate the way logic works in Docassemble, because I feel like a lot of people get really deep in Docassemble without understanding some sort of basics of the way that logic works in the peculiar Docassemble universe. So I'll make an analogy to the sailors on board a big boat, like a steam-powered ocean liner. Suppose that you've got a situation where the boat is operated by a bunch of sailors who work in shifts. And the way that it works is at the start of each shift, a sailor goes up to the bridge, the control room, and the way they know how to do their job is they can consult a to-do list, and then they just follow the steps to the letter on the to-do list. But there's a catch. If the sailor needs to get an item from the storage room in order to carry out their task, then they go off shift, and then when that item is ready from the storage room, a new sailor takes that item, brings it up to the bridge, and then they begin the new shift where they follow the same steps, consult the to-do list, and follow the steps. And you are the captain, but you just want to sit in the captain's quarters all day long and take a nap and smoke your pipe. So you want this ship to run like a well-oiled machine without your intervention. So you write to-do lists on index cards, and you keep those index cards in a container up on the bridge where the sailors can find them. And you use this to give them instructions on what to do. So for example, let's say that you are your first assignment as captain. You write out an index card of things you want the sailors to do, and you put this in the little box on the bridge. And so the first sailor comes up, and he turns the throttle to full. He turns the ship north, goes north for 10 nautical miles, that slows the ship down, turns the ship to face the east, and then you're on course toward your destination. And then your next item on the to-do list is polish the ship's bell. So the sailor says, well, I don't have any metal polish. So the sailor goes down to the storage room to get the metal polish. But as I said, when they go down to the storage room to get something, they go off shift. Like, it takes a long time for the storage room person to produce the item. So then a new sailor comes up, takes the metal polish, goes up to the bridge, and follows the to-do list. And they turn the throttle to full and they head north. And you're the captain, you're sitting in your quarters, and you think, wait, why is the ship suddenly throttling in full? Why are we turning? This is crazy. We're supposed to be on course to our destination. So you messed up. You wrote a bad to-do list. And so what is the reason for your mistake? Well, it relates to the concept of idempotency, which is a big word for a pretty simple logical concept. And I use this word in the documentation and on Slack, and I never define it. I kind of expect people to look it up on Wikipedia if they don't know it. But it refers to a pretty simple concept, which is that if you have some operation like pressing a button or whatever, it should act the same way whether you press it, whether you do the operation once or twice or multiple times. So they give an example here on the Wikipedia page of a stop and start button, like you might have on a train or something. It would make a lot of sense for the stop button to just do stop rather than to be like a toggle. Like if two people try to slam the stop button at the same time, it shouldn't like stop and start. Or if you start the engine and then you press the start button again, it shouldn't like mess up the engine. It should just do nothing. So that's the concept of idempotency. And so if you are writing a index card for sailors to follow, where all they do is just follow the steps you give them, you're going to want to write that index card in a way that is idempotent. So how would you change your index card to satisfy the idempotency requirement? Well, you could use a concept of a checklist. So you would want your index card to have a checkbox that the sailor can check if they have done the thing. And then you could have another index card that shows how to do that thing. So if the job is to make sure the ship is pointed in the right direction, you can select the index card for pointing the ship in the right direction. And then when the sailor has done that, they check it off so that the next sailor doesn't need to repeat those steps. Now that this card still isn't quite good because the card still says polish the ship's bell and then add oil to the engine. You know, you don't want the ship's bell to be needlessly polished, and you don't want to keep adding oil to the engine until you like flood it or something. So a better way to write the card would be to have some conditional statements. So if the bell is not shiny, then polish it. If the oil level is less than a certain amount, then add more until it reaches the correct amount. So that will solve the idempotency problem there. Another way that you could manage to-do lists in your capacity as the lazy captain is to, in addition to having checkboxes, have a concept of marking a whole index card as done. Because then it could be in the box, but the sailors would just know to completely skip it. Another thing you might want to do is give some instructions to sailors that they would need to carry out at the beginning of every shift, no matter what, to make sure that their shirt is tucked in and that they have the correct posture and that they have announced to the reporting officer that they're reporting for duty or whatever. So you could have cards that are always executed every time a sailor comes up. So how does this analogy relate to Docassemble? Some of you might know what I'm talking about already. So this card I offered here that had the idempotency problem that looked like this is totally analogous to a code block that refers to an undefined variable. So if you get to the point where it says rub bell with metal polish is an undefined variable. That's like going to the storage room to get an item you don't have. That will cause the code to stop executing, and then when it asks the user a question for metal polish and it starts again, it will repeat those steps. which you don't want. This concept of solving that problem with a checklist item is analogous to this programming style that I use all the time. And I think most people use it, but some people kind of avoid it, which is to have little indicator variables that are set to true when they're defined. And so your mandatory code block just asserts the ship should be pointed in the right direction. So if this variable is not defined, go out and define it by doing these steps. But if it is defined, then the code just executes past it very quickly and goes on to the next thing. So this card, or this card would be implemented with code that looks like this. But as I mentioned, it's not perfectly idempotent because it would polish the bell too many times or fill the engine too much. So the next thing you can do is add conditional statements or control statements in Python. Like while the engine oil level is less than the desired amount, add engine oil. The concept of marking a whole index card as done so the sailors can just skip past it is the concept of the mandatory code block. So the mandatory means that you need to get through the whole thing, but once you get through the whole thing, it is marked as completed and it never executes anymore. And the concept of something that you do at the beginning of every shift, tucking in your shirt and standing up straight, that's the concept of the initial code block, which it should not, if you want to get through it, it shouldn't raise any exceptions. And these ones probably don't. But that's the concept of initial code blocks in Docassemble. But I bring this analogy up to demonstrate that the way that Docassemble's logic works is not just like some weird computer thing that I thought up. It's a logical consequence of the idea of writing out really explicit instructions that can be followed by somebody who isn't like using deep thought about what's right and wrong about the instructions. So some interview systems will use a flowchart analogy, but I think this to-do list analogy is more appropriate when you have high levels of complexity. Because with a flowchart, you can't model out every possible thing that could happen because it would just get way too complicated. It would be too hard to envision all of the possible things that could happen. But if you have a system of checklists, you can just articulate, like, these are the things that should be done step by step. So that whatever weird stuff happens in your situation, you can at least ensure that the checklist items get done and that things are sane. So another analogy I sometimes use is more of a lawyer analogy, which is taking a deposition of a deponent. If you have a really comprehensive plan for taking your deposition, you could write out the instructions on what questions should be asked. And you could have those steps followed by not a team of associates, say, who like work in shifts, kind of like the sailing. So that even if somebody has a bad short-term memory or that the deposition is done in phases, as long as you follow that to-do list, you're going to ask the correct questions and get the answers you need. And so it does seem like it repeats the same logic a lot. You're like constantly checking over the same items, and it might seem duplicative, but computers are fast these days. So it's a good thing to do that because it ensures that if things change, like the deponent changes their answer to some question that they previously answered, as long as you're following that to-do list, you won't lose track of the logical consequences of a change in an answer, because you go through all the steps and it'll pick up on anything that has changed and adjust for it. So this is the framework that Docassembly uses for its logic. It's very different from SurveyMonkey or HotDocs or other systems, in that it's just trying to implement these to-do lists, and sometimes the logic that results from that is like so confusing you can't even wrap your head around it. But as long as you just stick to writing idempotent questions and code, it should all work out, and you'll have a document or whatever at the end of your interview that makes sense. Um, Next point I want to make, actually I have a couple kind of opinionated points to make, but I've noticed that we now have 39 participants, which is sort of a lot, but at least you're all on mute, so that seems to be working well. But if you do have questions or points to make, especially Quentin, feel free to chime in. Mark, are you going to say something? Okay. So the next point I want to make is Docassemble is a framework. So in general, don't fight frameworks. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of smart developers make, is when they're using a framework, is that they take advantage of it to some extent, but then they want to do their own thing. And so they end up working around the framework and instead of going sort of embracing the potential of the framework and also embracing the limitations. Of course, unless you're going to program in like raw machine code, your framework is going to impose limitations on you. So that's just a given. An example of this would be, suppose the framework you're using is Windows 10, and it has dialog boxes that look something like this. This is the style. There's software libraries that easily produce things that look like they have this style. But you really want your user interface to look like this for whatever reason, because you think this is just better. Well, if you're using the Windows 10 framework, this is going to be really hard to implement. Like, you're going to have to draw each of these pixels yourself. So while you could do that, theoretically, you could accomplish that interface within the framework of Windows 10. You probably shouldn't even try, because you're just making life 1,000 times harder for yourself. And if you have a hard time implementing that user interface, you can't say the framework sucks because it's hard. The framework, you're having a hard time because you're fighting against the framework. And I think this goes for just about everything. Like, I don't know if you use these technologies yourself, but if you have a website and it uses CSS, if you want to control the styling, just add CSS classes. Like, you don't go back to like the 1990s and set style attributes on all your elements. The framework is CSS, so make classes. Or if your framework is React JavaScript, don't try to include jQuery on the page and mix jQuery with React, because it's probably going to have all sorts of crazy interactions in it. Well, you're just going to end up being disappointed. Or if your framework is jQuery, just use jQuery functions to do everything instead of trying to write low-level JavaScript, because if you write your own JavaScript, you're probably going to run into browser and compatibility problems, and things aren't going to work the way you expect. So my point is just that you're going to be happier in the long run if you follow conventions of whatever framework you're using. And Docassemble itself is a framework. It's based on Python, Markdown, Mako, and stuff like that. So here's something that sometimes I see people who are very smart do in Docassemble. They want to have the question be in boldface, and so they use Markdown on every single question to add asterisks to make it a different font. Well, Markdown is not designed to be CSS. It's designed to just bold words in a sentence. If you wanted to like write the word "be honest" in all caps and in large letters, a section, it's not really a section heading. This is Markdown for a section heading. You're sort of you're commandeering Markdown to do things it wasn't made to do, because you want to have a different appearance on the screen. The convention in the Docassemble framework is to just modify CSS. And if you wanted to make every question bold, just add a class to a style sheet and set the font weight. And it's just this is much more elegant and simple. It means that your YAML can just be plain. You don't have to remember to mark up every single little question. And you can do that just by including this one little block into your code. Another thing that people do sometimes is reinvent things that Docassemble already has. So I saw that somebody created their own translation system, and like for every part of a question, they called their translation function. I guess this is fine. Like you can do this, but Docassemble has a built-in translation system. It has a number of them actually. So it's kind of like you made your code less readable for the sake of going your own way. And another thing that people do, which kind of makes me crazy, is that I look at their code and I'm like, wow, I can't even read this. What is this language? Oh wait, it is Docassemble, because they know that they can insert HTML into a question, and then suddenly their questions are like this highly customized thing that they created, and it's not really readable, and they're going to run into lots of problems because they're trying to write their own input elements on the screen and call their own JavaScript left, right, and center. It's just that if you find yourself using frameworks, but you're trying to use a different framework at the same time, you're just gonna it's just gonna result in a lot of bugs and unreadable code. And so maybe the issue is that you maybe want to pick another framework.
Jonathan, there was a question on the chat, which was, what are some good ways to learn about features that exist? The point was raised that sometimes people don't know that there's a way to do the thing that exists inside Docassemble already.
Well, one of the easiest questions on Slack to answer is there a way to do this? And I can answer them with a hyperlink to the documentation. And the documentation is really kind of long because I don't really consider feature creep to be a problem, and I just will add features for all sorts of things, and the documentation is kind of hard to search and navigate as a result. But I think with a lot of the stuff, that's one of the reasons why Slack is good, is that there is a way to do things within a framework. It might not be totally ideal, but you can do it. One of the aspects of the framework of Docassemble that sometimes very smart people sort of don't seem to get, or they fight against, is that Docassemble really is sort of a declarative programming environment. And I know Jason Morris is on the call, and he's probably going to say, no, it's not.
I'm totally on board.
Oh, okay. Because it kind of isn't. But the idea of a declarative and logic system, let me just give you some background on like what I mean by a declarative logic system. So procedural code is what most people recognize as computer code. It's just like one line after another, and it does stuff. It kind of thinks the way a microprocessor thinks. So the canonical example of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You would do that in computer code, just step by step. And it's actually more natural for people to think in terms of procedural code. And the declarative style would be just to declare all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and then have some type of like logic engine that derives things from that. And that's kind of the design of Docassemble. Although Docassemble is really a hybrid because it does allow you to write procedural code in the normal Python style. But at its heart, it is a declarative system. And so people sometimes make a mistake. They think they can use the systems that Docassemble has for undefined variables in these long procedural statements. So they'll find a list, and then they'll set there are any, and then they'll go through it, and then they'll set there's another to false. But that's just not how the system will work. And if you try to do this, you're going to get lots of weird errors in it, and it'll be difficult to use. So I think the thing that you want to embrace is writing short little code snippets that just declare things. So if you've got a list, just have an objects block that declares that my list is a D list. If you've got an attribute that you want to define, write a short little code block that says what it should be. and then have a block that defines how to answer the items for an item of the list. Have a block that defines whether there is another item in the list, and if you want to have a variable like reason for filing, you can have a short code block that just does that. And then your mandatory code block can just be very brief, and it can cause a lot of complicated things to happen without specifying all of them in one place. So if you want to gather the list, do my list gather, or refer to it in an implicit way that requires it to be gathered. And then your mandatory code block will be shorter, but it'll work better, and it'll have fewer errors because you're sort of embracing the declarative nature of the system. And I think some people don't like the declarative thing because it's kind of like when you're programming, and like some people have a gazillion functions, and it's really hard to follow any of the code because you always have to like look up, well, what is this function definition? But it does make sense to split things out into blocks, even though it is kind of a navigation headache. So like for things that are kind of complicated, like doing nested objects, it is fairly elegant and simple if you do it all in a declarative fashion. So if you wanted to have a list within a list, just declare it in your objects block that the fans attribute of a item in a list is a list itself. And here's a code block that declares what it means for an item in the list to be complete. And it even includes a whole gather process. So this does a lot of complicated stuff, but it's all in one little neat code block. Another aspect of the framework that people sometimes fight against is the fact that the Docassemble is based on Python and not some other language. So sometimes I see people write this, and this is really where I'm getting petty. Like they write equals true. Well, if you ask Python experts on Stack Overflow, they'll say, no, never write equals true. It's not what we do in Python land. And that's not the worst thing. What I really don't like is when people ignore the fact that Python has Boolean variables and they use strings to represent yes and no. Just don't do this. Python has Boolean types, so just give them good names that suggest that they're Boolean, and then your code should read like plain English, and you should be able to infer what the types are. And the other thing that people often do is that they have some other language that they would prefer to use, like they want to do things that are more client side as opposed to server side. But it's just going to be a lot harder to write like a whole lot of code in some other language than just to do what Python does. Now, I totally acknowledge that other languages are fine, and that sometimes server-side Python doesn't seem like a fast approach or a modern approach. But it is the way the system is designed, for better or for worse. So if you just do stuff in Python as opposed to trying to create your own code, I think you'll have a better time. And I acknowledge that people, when they're breaking away from frameworks, they have some reason to do that. Like maybe the result of user testing was that it really should work like this. And so you say, all right, let me just use all of my knowledge and skill to make it look like that. Well, you can do that, but in the process of breaking down the barriers of the framework, you might break the framework, and then the framework doesn't work, and then the framework doesn't have all the benefits that it would otherwise provide. So anyway, that's my spiel about following the framework.
A few people in the chat, Jonathan, were just asking about what the meaning of the variable I is in your example earlier, and whether we could use other variables to replace it.
The way that these index variables work is that I stands for an integer in an index for a list, or a key for a dictionary. And you can't just arbitrarily use different letters. You can have nesting up to like 5 or 6 levels. So you can use I, J, K, L, M, I think it is. So those are all reserved names, but you would only use J if you had a question that was sort of doubly nested. And I'm actually gonna get into that later. Yeah. Another concept that is somewhat related is the concept of a generic object where the variable is X. And that's the only variable that is used for the concept of a generic object. And I'll get into some of that in the next section. But definitely check out if you haven't used I before, you're going to want to check out the groups section of the documentation and get to know groups. So no, you can't nest past 5 levels. But really, if you're gonna do that, I think your code is probably massively complex. Okay.
I mean,
All right.
one thing that's worth saying is because you have generic objects, you usually don't need to nest that deep.
Yeah.
You can just make your question reflect that it's at that deeper level without having it to be explicitly stated in the question itself. That's probably not the best explanation of it, but the short answer is it won't stop you from doing anything usually.
Yeah. I mean, if you really do have a use case for more than like 5 levels of nesting, I would be happy to extend it. but I would be really impressed if you did. All right. So the next part of my presentation is just to sort of quickly do a reminder about Docassemble's logic system and how it works. The main thing that Docassemble does can actually be encapsulated on one slide. And this is kind of like the details that experts who've been using Docassemble for a while should know, is that the first thing that happens when the screen loads is that the interview answers are loaded from the storage area into this Python namespace where you can refer to those variables. And then layered on top of that, all of the names from this Python module called Docassemble base util are automatically loaded in. These are the functions that you know and love, like today, parentheses, or comma and list, or object names like DA list and things like that. All of those things come from this one module, Docassemble base util. After that, the blocks in your YAML that are imports and modules, like importing custom modules, custom names, or third-party Python modules, those are then run, and those names are imported. So this happens every single time the screen loads. And then your YAML is scanned from the beginning of the file to the end of the file, looking for any mandatory or initial blocks, and then it just runs them in order, but it skips any mandatory blocks that have already been run, so you can bypass a lot of the mandatory blocks.
Then just a vocabulary question. What does interview answers you mean here in this slide?
What I mean is like the variables that are that you have set with code blocks or questions. So like favorite fruit, for example, that's all in the interview answers. And on a technical level, actually what it is a Python dictionary. So the variables don't have any particular order. And that Python dictionary is serialized and stored in a database. And serialized just means that it is converted to plain text and then stashed away. So Jason asks, do singular nouns work better for DA list names? I've actually been persuaded on this question. I used to like to use, if I had a list called fruit, a list of fruits, I would call it fruit, and then I'd write fruit bracket 1 or something like that, because that makes sense to me in an English language level. But it's actually pretty convenient to have it be. Meng Wang is correcting me on my English. Oh, come on.
Both are
So I
acceptable.
chose a bad example. Yeah, like children. If you're instead of calling your list of children child, just call it children. And then the nice advantage of that is that you can write for child in children, and then it you at least have a nice noun that you can use. Otherwise, I'm like struggling to think what word should I use for the individual item. And yeah, I did say once that there was the object name method didn't work very well with singular nouns, but I think that's kind of like a rare problem. So I wouldn't worry about that anymore. All right, so getting back to the way logic works. This is all it is. And I think a lot of people learn this much, and then they just write all of their blocks as mandatory. But what happens when you encounter an undefined variable, either when you're composing a question or you have a code block that refers to a variable? Well, the execution of the code just totally stops. And you can see this if you try out the Python interpreter. You go to your command line and on your Mac and you type Python, you can get to this interpreter. If you refer to an undefined variable, it gives you an exception. It says name error, B is not defined. Well, that's actually what's happening in the back end of Docassemble. It's just that I'm trapping it and doing something with this phrase, name B is not defined. Or if you refer to a list item that doesn't exist, you get an index error. If you refer to a key in a dictionary that doesn't exist, you get a key error. Or if you refer to an attribute that doesn't exist, you will get an attribute error. So what all the Docassemble does is intercept those and then go hunting for a block that offers to define that undefined variable. And if that block is a question, it'll try to ask the question to the user. But if that block is a code block, it will try to just run the code on the server. And it might, with either of those things, it might encounter like yet another undefined variable, and so on in a very recursive, deeply nested fashion. So a lot of people sort of recognize the first part and then just try to write their Docassemble interview to be kind of like SurveyMonkey, where it just asks one question after another, which you can do, but you might as well be using some other system like Community Lawyer if you're not gonna take advantage of the whole undefined variable system in Docassemble, which is to have the best practice, in my opinion, is just to have like a single mandatory code block in your interview that refers to things, and then that results in non-mandatory questions or code blocks being run. So the real exciting thing about Docassemble, in my opinion, is what happens when there are multiple blocks that could potentially define a given variable. Like, what does Docassemble do if there are two blocks in the interview that define the variable favorite fruit? Well, the rules of statutory interpretation are followed. And this is where my law school background has influenced the design of Docassemble. The first rule is that the specific takes precedence over the general. So if you say, as a general rule, dogs have 4 legs, then but then you say, as a special rule, my dog Spot has 3 legs, then the specific rule will take precedence if the dog in question is Spot. The next rule of statutory interpretation is that these directives supersedes in order are respected, but hardly anybody uses those, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. And then the next rule is that a later rule takes precedence over an earlier rule. So the analogous concept in law would be that a statute enacted in 1980 is going to take precedence over a statute that was enacted in 1920. And in Docassemble, a code block that is defined at the beginning of your YAML file will be superseded by a code block that is defined later in the YAML file.
Jonathan, can you give an example of a question that is more or less specific and how Docassemble evaluates that?
Yep. So if your undefined variable is parties bracket one dot name dot first, the most specific block would be a question that just defines parties one name first. A relatively less specific one would be a block that defines parties I name first, meaning like using a variable like in math class, algebra. So any general I. And an even less specific, more general block would be a generic object block that operates on any individual and defines the name dot first attribute of an individual. So here's an example of a crazy undefined variable where you've got a dictionary of fruit, and there's information about its seeds, and there's this tally dictionary, and then there's a list of molecules, blah 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 blah. So what Docassemble actually does is it figures out all the different ways that undefined variable could be represented, from the most specific to the most general, and then it just goes through all of your YAML blocks and asks, well, do any of you define the variable as stated in this way? And so it starts out with a specific one, and then the next less specific is where the first dictionary item is an I. And it goes all the way down for several pages until it reaches the most generic thing, which is x.name. So as you can see, it can get pretty crazy, and you have a lot of options for defining a dot name of one of these molecules. So that's the sort of hierarchy of more specific to less specific. So then there's the rule. So that applies regardless of the order of anything in the YAML file. The next important rule of statutory interpretation is that a rule that is later in the YAML file will take precedence over an earlier rule. So if you have a undefined variable user.name.first, you can have a later rule that says if the user is in the database, take their name from a database, and that will be tried first. However, this code block might not actually succeed in defining username first. If the user is not in the database, that code block will be tried, but it won't succeed, and then it will fall back to using the earlier rule, which is to ask a question of the user. This is kind of like if there was a general statute that was enacted in 1920 that says like liquor stores can't stay open past 10 p.m. And then there is a statute in 1980 that said liquor stores in New York City are able to stay open past 11. Then if your liquor store is not in New York City, you just sort of go past that 1980 statute and you fall back to using the 1920 statute. Now, Roberto asks a very good question, which is, how does these rules about precedence in the order of the YAML file apply when there are files that are included with the includes directive? So all that the includes directive does, where you type includes and then you list some other YAML files, all it does is basically copy and paste the contents of those referenced files into the main YAML as though it were copied and pasted there. There are a few other things that relate to like the context in which things are used. Like if you refer to image names in a sub YAML file, it will be relative to the package in which that sub YAML file is applied. But basically all it does is it's like the legal concept of incorporated by a reference. Like sometimes if you have a contract, it'll say like the contents of something are incorporated by reference herein as though they were originally here. And so it doesn't really there is no real special rule about precedence when it comes to those included files. And Jason asks whether you can have more than one includes block. Yeah, you can put includes blocks wherever you want. They just have the effect of copying and pasting in the contents of those files in that place. So they could be at the beginning, they could be at the end. So here's some techniques about these fallback questions. So suppose you have a question, do you own a home? Yes, no, Boolean variable of home owned. But you develop your interview for a while, and then you realize, well, actually, I want to ask this question pretty differently if the user is married. In that case, I want to ask, do you or your spouse own a home? And then if they say that they do, I want to ask, do you own your home as tenants by the entireties, which is a legal concept if you don't have that in your country, that is only shown if the home actually is owned. Well, there are ways that you could do this all in one question block, but using this concept of a fallback question is actually a way to do it in a way that's kind of neat. There is this modifier called if that you can attach to any block, which will control whether or not the block is used when the code goes looking for a block that defines a variable like home owned. So if the undefined variable is home owned, it will first try this second block, and it will try the if statement. It'll evaluate user.married, and it will ask the question about whether you're married if it's not defined. And if the answer is no, then that block is just skipped, and it falls back to the simple question: do you own a home? So this is a pretty powerful technique for having for like managing the complexity of the things you want to ask in an interview. Now, one confusing thing, I know people love cramming as much as possible onto one screen. So you might have a JavaScript-based like show if on a screen, and you might want there to be fallback if the user doesn't. If a variable doesn't get defined on a question because it's hidden by a show if, you might want it to fall back to another question. But it actually doesn't work that way. It will always ask a question if that question could theoretically be answered by the user. So Caroline asks, why would you use if instead of putting this logic into your code for ordering the interview? I mean, I guess I mean, if the logic in your interview just asks for the variable home owned, like you're not going to, it's going to be kind of confusing to like select a particular question with your logic. Your logic should just sort of specify what's legally true, and the whole user interface question of like what questions are asked to generate that should kind of be external to your your code for ordering the interview. So I think it makes more sense to use an if statement, but this is totally a matter of style. If you can get it to work another way and you think that's more readable, that's fine. And Mark asks whether the if statement takes any Python expression, and yes, it'll evaluate a Python one-liner, which could do all sorts of stuff. And I have no idea what Michelle means by it being truthy. I think that's some computer science term. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't need to evaluate to a Boolean variable, but it just needs to. It will be evaluated for its truth, and in Python, like an empty string is considered to have the truth or falsity of false, whereas the string apple would have a truth value of true. So that's how the if statement is evaluated. All right, so I'm going to stop talking. I've gone on for quite a while. I intended for this to be more interactive. I'm going to copy into the Docacon Advanced channel on Slack a little code snippet in YAML. Sorry, I gotta fix the formatting for a second. And your task is to load this up into your playground. All right. And load that up into your playground, run it, see what it does. I'm gonna share my playground and show you what it looks like. All right, so this is a very simple questionnaire about one's assets. It asks, do you have a car? If so, how much is your car worth? Do you have cash? No. Do you have a house? Yes. How much is your house worth? And it says your assets are worth a certain amount. But you'll notice that it asks, do you have a cache? And so, you know, the genericness of the questions doesn't work quite well. So your task over the next few minutes, working on your own, is to one, ask the question, do you have a cache, in a better way that makes more sense. Second, force this interview to assume that the user always has a house, so they're not asked whether they have a house. And also, the challenge, if you have time for it, is figure out how to make this interview, instead of asking about cash, house, and car, ask about boat and kayak. But the ground rules are that you're not allowed to edit any existing blocks, and you can't add any blocks that are mandatory. So you just have to add blocks to this interview and make those changes to the code. So I'll stop talking for a while so you can work on that. Let me show that slide again. Yeah, the ground rules are you not allowed to edit existing blocks, and you can't add any mandatory blocks, in case you're tempted to solve the problem by adding a mandatory block.
I just wanted to remind people too, if you haven't signed up for an account on a Docassemble server, and if you need one, you can do it at the server I just put in the chat, and I will activate your account so you have developer access.
Sorry, where's the code again?
The Docassemble Advanced channel of Slack.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
if anybody has a result yet, feel free to post it in Slack.
So we're supposed to have it ask for only the 2 items, boat and kayak, instead of the 3?
Yeah, well, I think the first, that's the third step. Yeah. There's one block that you could add to this interview that would make it ask for boat and kayak instead of the 3 things that it does. All right, I'm getting a lot of answers, which is great. I have a couple more things to say before we take a break, in which I will give you a challenge assignment. So the first person to get it, who was much faster than the others, was Toby, veteran of several Docacons, who got it right away. Let me share my playground. So the first question was to ask the cache question differently, and so Toby did that by adding another question to the interview that, instead of asking for assets I exists, asks for assets cache exists. And note that he put it right at the top of the interview. So even though the more general question is later in the YAML file, like it was enacted in 1980 as opposed to 1920, this will take precedence because it is more specific. And then, as far as making sure that the house actually exists, he added a code block that just asserted that if it's if you're talking about assets house exists, it's equal to true. And the challenge number 3, which people struggled with, was that the objects block is not just like some grand global declaration. It's actually just a block like others, like a code block or a question block, which I guess I was kind of hiding the ball on that. And in fact, each line is kind of like its own code block. So all that Toby did was add a block to the interview called objects, and it used a different set of keys. And so this block right up here in the original YAML is just totally disregarded, because if the name assets needed to be defined, the first thing it would do is use this objects block, which defines it, and then it's defined. So there's no reason to go searching for any other block. There were some creative attempts to do that other ways. Jason Morris had a code block that would be triggered by whether cache exists, which asserted that there should be a boat and a kayak, which I think probably works. But as he said himself, that it was a bit kludgy, because it didn't actually get rid of the original declaration of what the assets were. And then David basically got pointed out the 3 blocks that were added, and this is the same thing that Toby did. Let's see, Mark. Yeah, Mark actually got the same thing. Although I don't think this. He also added something that said code block for that defined assets.keys. I don't think that would do anything. It doesn't actually seek out keys. So that this is a sort of a non sequitur. But this is fine. Roberto. Roberto had something similar to the way Jason approached it. And I guess this might work, but I don't know. It's not the way I would do it. Stefan got the same thing as Dave. Did basically the same thing as David. Excellent. Although you don't need initial. That's not the initial true is not necessary. Michael said he got basically what Toby got. All right. Does anybody have any questions about that exercise?
So exist is something special. Dot exist is it's a feature or character, something. It's something you have to know about exists, that it does something.
Yeah, I'm actually sorry. I meant to mention that I'm using this object type called value, and value is a relatively little used object type in Docassemble that has a property called exists. And the whole thing is sort of triggered by this. Everything is triggered by this mandatory code block that sums up the value of the value object for all of the values in the dictionary, but only if the object exists.
Could
I
you
should have
also
explained
have
this.
done something using append to the dictionary? Would you do that? Would that be a way to go or no?
You can't really append to a dictionary. You can set keys in a dictionary, which is kind of what's going on here in Roberta's answer. Although in the way that you add a key and a value to a dictionary in Docassemble is by using, if it's an object, is to use the initialize object method of the DA dictionary. That's kind of complicated. All right, let me get back to my presentation. We'll take a break before 10:30, and we'll take a break. It's pretty long because it has a homework assignment. So I just want to explore something about what happens when an undefined variable actually gets defined. So if you have a code block that stores information using an API, and it first sends an email, and then it calls a function called store information using API, and it refers to API key, but then API key is not defined. It will stop executing, and it will go and fetch the value of API key, but then it will rerun this thing again. And you might be wondering, well, why does it send the email twice? Well, it's because you have an idempotency problem. And so I wanted to show you a quick interview in the playground. That simply asks for three variables to be defined, A, B, and C, and then shows a final screen. A is defined by a question. B and C are defined by code, and then the final screen just shows the value. So a very simple interview. What is A? Say it's 3, and then it says it does some computations. And if you look at the source, and it shows you the history of its thinking process. Scroll down to how this question came to be asked. It tried to run the mandatory code block, which is what it does. It tries to run mandatory code blocks. It needed the definition of B, so it ran this code block. And then it tried to run the mandatory code block again. So it ran A, B, and C again. And then it needed the definition of final screen, and that's why it showed this screen. So if you run into crazy idempotency problems, you don't know why the interview is doing what it is doing, going to source and reviewing this can show the thinking process that Docassemble used. And note that it is running the mandatory code block more than once in the same session. That's what causes things like emails getting sent twice when you don't want them to. So let me make this one quick little change to this interview. Suppose that I have a code block that gets triggered, and then that triggers another exception, which runs yet another code block. So it'll run the code block to set C, and let's just see what happens. This is kind of an arcane detail, but it has come up on Slack, so I wanted to show this group of experts. So it asks, what is A? And then the history of it is it tried to run the mandatory code block. It needed B, so it tried to run this code block, but then it needed C, and so then it ran the code block to define C. And then what it does is it asks the code block for that defines B again. Note that it did not go back to the very beginning. It did not go back to the mandatory block. It just went back to the next most block. So this is kind of a wrinkle in the whole idempotency thing. So if you have a code block that refers to another code block that refers to another code block, it'll just sort of go up and rerun that code block again. It won't actually run that mandatory. It won't go back to the very beginning of the interview logic and run mandatory. So it's really, you can often get into these tricky situations when you have API calls or things that shouldn't run more than once, and yet they do. All right, so I've got a question from Matt saying, I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly in this code block. Does Docassemble figure out that the assets are cached based on the question text? Well, what it does is it realizes that assets cache is undefined, and so it looks for some code block that defines it. It will try the most specific thing first, which is assets cache exists, and if it doesn't find any block that defines that variable in that way, it will go to something more general, and then it will ask if assets I exists, and so in that way you can use these specific question to override the general. Trying to find an example. I'm not seeing it. Yeah, so this is the most specific thing that will be used for the cache, used when assets cache exists is needed, as opposed to when assets house exists is needed. Oh, shoot, I wasn't sharing my Slack screen. I was talking and I was sharing the wrong screen. I'm sorry. Let me just, and for purposes of time, let me move back on to the presentation. I'm going to give you an assignment. We're going to break for about an hour. And before I give the assignment, I just want to give a quick overview of how list gathering works, which I think is probably necessary because we did get some questions about the variable I. So the list gathering works in a declarative fashion. So the first thing you do if you have a list that you want to gather is declare what the list object is, using some objects block. And the sort of advanced way to do list gathering is to always use objects, and always use a complete attribute. And complete attribute is somewhat of an advanced feature, but it's really helpful to use it, because then you can really specify exactly what you mean by a list item being completely gathered. Because you might want to ask one question, you might want to ask 20 questions for each item. And the block that defines what it means for a item to be complete allows you to just specify what those things are. So this code block here will be run anytime it needs to make sure that an item in a list is complete. It'll ask for the name of a fruit and then the color of the fruit, and then it'll be satisfied that the fruit item is gathered. Another thing that you can declare is, how do you determine whether there are any more objects to be added to the list? And that's by asking a question, like, are there any more fruits? All right, no, sorry, this is referring to, are there any? So is the list 0 or not? Are there any fruits? Then you ask about the list items themselves with questions, and it's helpful to use the function ordinal to convert 0 to first and 1 to second. Lists are always numbered from 0. Then ask if there are any more. That is the there is another attribute, which would close off the list gathering. And the thing that a lot of people overlook when they define lists is that they actually need to put something in the logic of the interview that causes the list to be gathered. There needs to be some reason to gather the list. And one of the ways to do that is to just use the name of the list in some context that requires the list to be gathered. So if you wanted to put fruits in a Mako construction, well, it's going to want to list them in a comma separated list. So that implies that it needs to be gathered. Or if you run a for loop on fruits, well, it's got to be gathered before you can run a for loop, so it'll cause it to be gathered at that time. If you wanted to manually trigger the gathering of a list, you would type fruits.gather. If you wanted to be really explicit about exactly when you want to start gathering an item. I'm going to give a more detailed description of list gathering in a session tomorrow. And if you wanted to do nested lists, you just declare more things. I mentioned this before, that you can just declare that the fans attribute of a given list item is a list itself, and it has its own complete attribute. And so you can do nested lists in that fashion. All right, so we're going to take a break, and let's return at 11:15. So you'll have time to get another cup of coffee or use the bathroom or something. But then I want you to work on this very challenging homework assignment, which is somewhat related to what we've talked about today, but is also kind of based on your past experience and on list gathering. And so there's 2 components. I think you should be able to accomplish this one. The task is to create an interview that answers a complaint. And you want to be able to say in the answer to the complaint, paragraph 1 says such and such. So you want to ask the user, what does paragraph 1 say? And they'll type it in. And then with each one of these paragraphs, which you need to gather in like a list or something of your choosing, you need to say whether it is admitted or denied. So you could ask the user, like, do you admit or deny the assertion in that paragraph? But there's also a third choice. Well, if you could say that the user refuses to answer, that no answer is required. But then you want to give legal reasons why no answer is required. And the options I've given here, and you can choose your own. The substance of this doesn't matter. It's all about just the tech structure. You want to list some items like barratry, champerty, or the doctrine of dirty hands. If you've been to law school, you'll appreciate all this stuff. So this is kind of like a nested list, although hint, you do not need to use a nested list. So during the break, come back to 11:15, see if you can come up with an interview that comes up with an answer like this. You do not have to create an actual document. You can just put this into the sub question of some question. And then if you're really advanced, hint, hint, you should try, see if you can create a discussion section where you define all of the legal terms that were used in the answer. So if somebody refused to answer a question, they said it was not applicable because of barratry, you'll want to make sure that there's a paragraph in your discussion section that defines what barratry is, cites some cases that support what barratry is, and then lists the paragraphs that should be struck as a result. Now, this is something that you might actually do in real life in a legal interview. And I wrote this last night, and I actually didn't do it myself, but I did it myself this morning. And it actually was harder than I thought. So I don't think you'll get to this part, but if you do, I will be impressed. But at least work on the first part, which I think is totally doable. But this requires like envisioning how you would structure this information in a way that would make this type of stuff possible in the future. Anybody have any questions about this? I will also put it in Slack so you have that as a reference.
That was going to be my question. Whether it could go on the Slack. And actually, another question was raised, is this supposed to be a fixed list of options, those 1, 2, and 3 they have there, or is the user supposed to be able to add their own other reasons why?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, it's a fixed list. Don't let the user come up with the law. And so this, if you get to the challenge part, the case law and stuff is not part of the interview. It should be part of your YAML. Like you should predefine this stuff. Hint, there is a block called data, which is very useful for defining things that should just exist already. Any other questions? Couldn't select none of the above. And for the list of checkboxes in the checkbox question, I referred to the grounds list, which I defined up here using YAML. Let me just show the chat. I'm not seeing the chat at the moment. Hang on a sec. And I use the quote paragraphs function to put the paragraph text in quotes on the screen, which is kind of a nice thing. It adds the markdown for a block quote. And then for doing that sort of cross-reference thing where you have to summarize the grounds that were asserted and list the paragraph numbers that assert the grounds, I have a dictionary that I defined here, and I set auto gather to false. So this is like a dictionary where it's not going to be gathered by pestering the user for something. It's going to be gathered by code. And so for that, it looks for a code block that defines the gathered attribute of the dictionary. And then I just wrote some Python code that starts out for idempotency reasons by clearing the grounds, and then loops through all the paragraphs. And if it says the response was refused, then it goes through the grounds for which you refused to answer. And then I initiated this is where it gets really complicated. I initiated a DA list inside of that dictionary. So it's a dictionary of lists. And I appended the paragraph number, the index number, which is just I plus 1, to that list. And so then in my document, I could just loop through the grounds of the paragraphs, and I call these various data structures that I created using data blocks. The definition of what the ground is, a comma and list for the citations to case authorities. I use the as noun method of the DA list to either show the word paragraph or paragraphs, depending on whether the list has one or more elements. And then just the, I referred to grounds paragraphs G, which is a list, and so that defaults to separating them by comma and. So it'll say paragraphs 1 and 2 should be struck as a result. So that was the bonus part was definitely pretty challenging. I thought the main part of just asking for the text of a paragraph and whether you object or not is sort of a fairly simple list gathering exercise.
Can I ask you a question about that, Jonathan?
Yeah.
In your big code block there, if the user was to get to the end of the interview and then back up and change their response to the last paragraph, would your list of grounds paragraphs get updated?
It would not, and that is an extremely good question. And I noticed that in your interview, Jason's interview, I think you added reconsider true, which is perfect. So the problem is actually what I'm going to be talking about in the last half hour of the presentations is what to do with review screens when the user can arbitrarily go back and edit stuff in an interview. Because you'll run into situations where your conclusion has already been made, and yet then the prerequisites of that conclusion are altered, and you're stuck with the conclusion you already made, and what you need to do is know when to invalidate that conclusion. And the reconsider, adding reconsider true means that every time the screen loads, you undefine the grounds paragraphs gathered so that it gets recomputed when the document is shown again. Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's see. Toby, somebody asked whether the as noun verb method works in Spanish to pluralize a noun. It does work in Spanish. I believe if you appropriately set the language to Spanish, then there's a package that I'm using that does support various languages that are spoken in Western Europe. It doesn't support all languages, but it supports a bunch. And it does things like verb conjugation, articles on nouns, and noun pluralization and singularization. So yeah, that should work. And the other thing you can do, even if it doesn't support your language, is it's not too hard to write some logic that either shows the singular or the plural version of some noun. Let's see, Toby had a response. I'm copying it out of Slack right now. So here's Toby's interview. What is the text of the first paragraph? How do you respond? I say no answer is required. Use the drop down. I'm going to say barred by Barratry and dirty hands. Is there another paragraph? Oh, no, there's an error. Let's just look at his code. So he defined reasons using a code block, which is fine. Kind of like my data block, but just a different style. And he used a second, he kind of like me, he used a second object, a dictionary. But he actually predefined the reasons as the keys. And he also used a reference number like I did, I+1. Yeah, that's very similar. Yeah, he used a code block to find W number, the reference number. And he used this sort of concept of an object that has an exists attribute, like whether it is used or not. And so instead of using data objects, he just used regular old Python, which is great. Let me just try it again. How do I respond? I say, no answer is required, and the reason is because of dirty hands. Another one, I'm going to say, no answer is required because of dirty hands and barratry. So here we go. Paragraph 1 states this, no answer is required because 1, this is barred by dirty hands. Paragraph 2 states this, no answer is required because 1, it looks like the number is not incrementing there. And then he has a discussion that looks a little incomplete, but at least it runs without an error. All right, so I want to move on to talking about review screens. And I'm going to post my answer in Slack first. Just hang on a second while I attach a code snippet to Slack. And when I attach a code snippet to Slack, I always set the type to YAML so that it does colorization appropriately. Right, so I posted the official answer to Slack. And by the way, I haven't shown off my t-shirt yet. I've got a Docker t-shirt on. It's the only nerdy t-shirt I could think of to wear today. I actually got this t-shirt when I first discovered what Docker was, before I even used it. And I got the t-shirt because I thought, oh my gosh, that logo with a whale in it is so cute. So I have to have that t-shirt. And then later I learned how to use Docker, and now I use it all the time. But you always follow the open source software that has a cute animal logo. That's my motto. Or follow consulting companies that have a cute llama logo. All right, so let's talk about doing review screens, and I'm going to do this part of the session in a somewhat interactive way. I'm going to give you a code block in Slack that I want you to copy and paste into your playground and try out. So on the Docacon Advanced page on Slack, I just posted something called Try This in Your Playground. And you can do more actions in view raw. That's a nice way to be able to easily copy and paste the text. But try this interview in your playground. I'll give you a moment to do that. So it's a fairly simple interview. When you run it, it asks how old are you and your annual income to determine if you're eligible for free insurance. And if I say my income is really low, then it asks me if I have employer-provided insurance. If I don't, then I'm eligible. So this is a interview that asks a series of questions and produces some result at the end. So what if I want to give the user some ability to go back and change those answers? Now, the traditional thing that a lot of guided interview systems do is they have like forward-backward navigation, where you just go back and then forward again to edit answers. But it doesn't really work with the logic model of Docassemble, which is all about deriving stuff from the state of answers. And it also doesn't really work if a lot of your questions have buttons, because some of the questions that have buttons might be fairly complicated and the user might not remember what button they clicked to move forward. So yeah, we don't have a forward-backward navigation system. And so the thing to do is to give the user the ability to review the answers that they have provided so far. And the block that is helpful in this regard is called review. And so I'm going to give you this snippet of text. I'm going to copy it into Slack. And I want you to take it and copy and paste it, and then add it anywhere in the interview that you have. It's this thing called untitled down at the bottom. And so it's using a couple features. Just I'll give you a sec to add that to your interview. All right, so you can see here that the first thing I'm doing is I'm adding a default screen part. And if you're not familiar with this feature, it allows you to customize all sorts of different parts of the screen by adding text, which you can form using Mako and various variables if you need to. And so what this is doing is adding some text that goes under every question that says you can edit answers at any time. So if I say I'm 543 years old, I can click, you can edit answers at any time. And when I click that, what it does is it runs an action called review answers. And if you haven't used actions before, it's a fairly complicated system, so you should read up on it. But here's an example of its use by directing you to a review screen. This review your answer screen is a special type of question which will show you any number of answers that you have provided. And it's kind of like the fields block in a question, except it's called review, and it lists a number of fields. You can, just like in a field specifier, you can use field and label. So the syntax is a little bit junky because of my need to maintain backwards compatibility and stuff. So it's a little bit user unfriendly. I'm sorry about that. But the idea here is that it says you said you were 543 years old. So you're sort of restating what the user told you. So there's a little bit of Mako that allows you to restate what the user said, and then you can have a button that has a label of your choosing, and I always choose edit. And then it will allow you to edit the field years old. And so what that is doing is if I click that button, it is telling your interview, force ask the question years old. So I click that and I'm taken right back to that same question I saw before. How old are you? With all of its associated text. And I can change it to something that is more appropriate. I'm 19 years old. And then when I press continue, I go right back to the review screen again. So the review screen is sort of not part of the normal interview logic flow. It's something that I'm sort of forcing the interview to show. And then when I click the resume button, I go back to the normal interview logic, and it's asking whatever the next question is, which is the question about income. So Michelle, could you unmute and explain your question?
Sure. So if their income depends on their age, like if you only want to ask the income question if they're over 100 or something, and then they edit their answer to say of their age to say that they're 20, right? What happens to the income question and to the information from the income question?
Well, the information in the interview answers won't be changed. So it'll still exist in the interview answers. But whether this question, what is your annual income, is even asked, will depend on the interview logic. So according to the interview logic,
I guess my question is, if they've already answered the income question, what happens, right? If a question they edit affects, if they're on page 5 and they go back and edit page 1, and page 3 had a question that depended on it, what happens to that question and that information?
Yeah, it's a good point. Like basically the answer is, well, nothing happens to it. It's still a variable in the interview answers. It's not changed. So currently I have the situation where I'm 19 and I make 23,423. If I edit my age to be 10, it just changes the interview answers. The amount I earn is still listed here, and I actually should be eligible for free insurance because I'm 10 years old, according to the logic of the interview. So this is actually a faulty. I'm illustrating a fault in editing user answers.
So I guess my question is, say you said you had a child, and then you filled in the name, the information for the child, the name, date of birth, everything. Then later on you figured out, oh, they meant, a biological child and my child is adopted. So then you go back and you change it to have no children. You don't have any children. But how do I as a coder deal with the fact that they have then gotten rid of the child and there's all this child information hanging around that would be filled out on the form?
I think Michelle's looking for, like, there are 3 options that you can use to kind of play around with dependent variables. That's really, I think, what you're talking about. So you can use set, you can just undefine, invalidate, and recompute. So those are kind of gone into on the documentation for the review screens, which are definitely, there's a lot to review screens.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what I'm covering here in this part of the training. And that is one way to do it. But I wanted to illustrate a sort of quick fix to this problem, just in this example, where even though I said I was 10 years old, it's saying I'm still not eligible. Okay. There is a feature that is fairly new called depends on, or I can, and this is actually somewhat related to what Jason was talking about with the reconsider, but it's kind of more targeted. So I can say that this code block depends on the variable annual income, which means that if annual income were to be changed, I should reconsider the variable income eligible. And same with this code right here. This code block for eligible for free insurance depends on years old, and also depends on income eligible, and has employer insurance. So were any of these variables to be changed, I should reconsider eligible for free insurance. And so now what happens when I run this interview? Let me start out by saying that I'm 500 years old and I have loads of money. I'm not eligible. But then I said, oh, let me edit my answers. I'm actually not 534 years old. I'm 5 years old. When I resume, it will say the correct answer, which is you are now eligible for free insurance, because I have written my code blocks in a way that adjusts for changes to those variables. And so it's actually pretty complicated behind the scenes. So it looks at whether a question or a code block has actually caused a change in the years old variable or the income eligible variable. So now I have sort of rationalized this. Now you could even go a step further and like hide items from the list. if you wanted to in the review answers. But what this problem highlights is that if you are using the fact that a question is defined as something in your logic in your document, like if the employer provided insurance variable is defined, then do this. That's going to get you into trouble if you are using review screens, because something might be defined in your interview answers but not applicable because the user went back and made a change. And so if you're including paragraphs in a document based on whether a variable is defined, that's kind of arbitrary, because it's basing the logic off of like the presence or absence of a variable in the interview answers rather than what's legally relevant, which in this case would be like how many years old you are or whether you're employed. And so although I do have functions called like defined and things like that, I actually don't recommend relying on them too much. Michelle, could you explain your latest question on Zoom?
Yeah, sorry, it was back when we were looking at the depends on screen. I was wondering if reconsider does a similar thing to depends on, except for it just looks for all the variables used in the block instead of just the ones you listed.
So if you were to set reconsider true,
Yeah.
like Jason did in the example that he wrote earlier, what that says is every time the screen loads, undefine any variables that are defined in this block. And I forgot, but I think you can use reconsider with a list. So maybe you can do this.
You can, yes.
Does it amount to just running the block again? I mean, I thought that's what depends on only does it conditional on a few variables, and reconsider does it all the time?
It depends on only invalidates eligible for free insurance when and if these variables change, whereas reconsider invalidates every single time the screen loads.
Okay, yeah, that was the question. Perfect.
Which is a little bit overkill. Meng, could you explain your question? If you unmute.
Yeah, it seems to me that what you're saying here and depends on, shouldn't that just sort of fall out of the existing code? Like it should be possible for the engine to say, well, these are the things that depend on other things, and you don't need to tell me that.
Well, I think I could do that, but you might have variables that get referenced in a code block that that actually aren't terribly relevant, and where you don't really care about changes to them. And you might, if it were automatic, like if it could just be like an automatic depends on, I think that you might be invalidating the variables too frequently.
Right, I see. Okay, that makes sense.
But it is a good point. Like it would be good if I could sort of make this more automatic so you wouldn't have to type things out. It does get into like Python parsing and stuff like that.
One thing to think about there too is we're not fully declarative. So, I mean, there's all kinds of side effects your code blocks could have that you really might not want to have those invalidated as often. So having the right default is really hard to choose there.
Yeah, especially if your code block is doing something like sending an email or calling an API. You wouldn't want it to run more often than it needed to. Like you might have an API that should only be rerun if you change your social security number, for example. So it's good to be able to control. Depends on.
Maybe a depends on modifier that doesn't make you list out the options, just depends on true.
Yeah, I might be able to do that, and then it could just.
That's what I was thinking. Maybe
scan for.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just saying. I thought reconsider could act in that role, though it's a bit overkill, but in some situations.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I know. So I would definitely advise using these review blocks in your interview, and think of, even though you might postpone it until later in your development process, it's important to think about these review blocks while you're designing the interview, because you'll want to make sure that your interview logic and your document are set up to adjust for arbitrary changes to the interview answers. So it kind of changes the way you think about coding an interview. Like if the user can't go back and edit things except by undoing, then it actually makes your life easier as a developer. But it's much better for the user if they can actually make the changes. So here's another example of a way to do it. And since we're kind of short on time, I'm just going to demonstrate it. Here's the way that you can give the user a different type of interface for going back and changing answers. So suppose you put in an address, and then you say, I'd like to buy linoleum, and how much square footage produces an invoice with it. You can go back and change by clicking the section headers. And so it has a review block for each section. If you have a really long interview, you wouldn't want to have a review block that had every single variable listed on one screen. You could break it up into with section headings and stuff, but it's kind of inconvenient. So it's nice to be able to just navigate to things. And then you can have multiple edit buttons that go back and let you change things in your interview. But I think the only trouble with this interface is that you kind of have to teach the user that they can do it, because they might not just explore. So that's a tricky user interface question. You could do default screen parts under click section headings to change your answers. And I actually have used this, and it's been successful with users. But it's sort of the downside of it is that you've got this message on every single screen, and you're junking up the screen with instructions, and that's not ideal. But at the end of the day, there are trade-offs, and I don't know that there is an ideal. But if you have any ideas about a user interface that would indicate in a very intuitive way that doesn't involve lots of instructions about how to go back and change answers. When I use TurboTax, for example, there are headings, and I click them and I go back.
I don't have an idea, but I do want to ask about or think about what this would look like on mobile devices, because some target audiences, some clients you're working with are mostly going to be using mobile devices. So
right.
I don't know what this does look like. I haven't done that yet, but on a mobile device. But if you are designing for that audience, you also want to account for situations in which screen elements wouldn't be visible on a mobile device.
So one of the things that I have on my to-do list is to change the way that these section headers work, so that they do appear on mobile, because currently if you shrink the screen, they disappear because there's just so little real estate on a mobile screen. However, what I found does work is changing these sections to be horizontal at the top of the screen. You can get that to work pretty well on mobile, and then you can have those available to the user. But by changing the default screen parts, you can play around with a variety of different ways of directing people to a screen to change their answers. And if you have a long interview, the user will appreciate some navigation aids in like finding the appropriate thing to change. And these review screens are actually really helpful because, and TurboTax uses these too, because they restate the information that you've provided in a different way. And that helps users realize when they have made a mistake.
All right, thank you.
Just like seeing it presented in a different way. And as Quentin says, it is a lot of work to create review screens because, for every question that you write, now you have to write another sort of element in a review screen. And when I've done it on a long interview, yes, it is a lot of work, but I've also found it to be pretty rewarding because it allows you to see like a user's answers at a glance. And that's pretty cool. So let me show you another example. Like suppose you have a list of things like fruits with seeds, and then vegetables with calories. This is an example where it produces a list of foods that you should avoid based on two lists that you provide. So there are two lists, fruits and vegetables, that are gathered kind of in the same way. You've got this nice complete element list. But then there's the question of recalculating this foods to avoid dot gathered. And there's nothing in this interview that causes that list to be recalculated. So I think in the next version, this is my big message to you, since we're running short on time, is that you really should subclass and make use of subclasses. A lot of people avoid writing Python modules. I think they don't like the fact that it requires the server to restart. So I solved the problem of recalculating the foods you should avoid in this example, not through the use of depends on or reconsider, but by simply pushing the foods you should avoid list to a module called foods, where I subclass individual. So instead of referring to the user as an individual, I refer to them as a foodie, somebody who likes food. And I have a function, a method, foods to avoid, that acts on self. And it looks at self.fruits and self.vegetables and returns a regular Python list of foods to avoid. So every time the interview needs to know what foods to avoid in that final screen, these are the foods you should stay away from, it simply calls a method on the user. And that's nice and neat. I think it's easy, it's nice and readable. And it moves sort of the complicated stuff to a module where coders can deal with it and the subject matter experts don't have to look at it. But the nice thing about a method is that it's called every time it's needed. And so it's always recomputed. You don't have to worry about whether there's some variable sitting out there that is stale. And so this is ultimately the thing I recommend that people do more of, is storing basically all of your interview answers inside of an object rather than in different variables, because then you can write methods. And if once you start going down the road of writing methods that act on objects, then I think you'll find that you can do things in a very uncomplicated fashion. But I understand that it is somewhat complicated. I'm talking about object-oriented programming to lawyers or whatever. But I think since you're all advanced users, you should keep going down that road. Now I know we're at the 12 o'clock mark. Stefan, could you explain your question?
Yes, it is related to the left navigation system that you showed earlier, and the need, you sort of addressed it in your presentation, that you really need to create a different review screen for each section in the navigation, and that could be a lot of work. And most of the time, when a user clicks the any item in a navigation, it's usually because the user wants the opportunity to change his or her answer. So I was wondering if there's a way to go directly to that part in essentially invalidating the previous answer, thus making the question being asked again, just like would happen if you press the green edit button.
So the section headings here, when I click purchase, what it's actually doing is running what's called an action. And it's running the action called purchase section. So I could set this to any name I want, and it will
doesn't have to be a review screen.
Yeah, it doesn't have to refer to a review screen. This could refer to a variable like favorite fruit, and then it would just, and then clicking that would then result in like directly showing a specific question. So you can do that too. You can also have that action run code. Go ahead.
Yeah, the part where the action runs code is the way I've tried to do it. But as I understood what you just said, if I just use any regular variable, then the effect of activating that link would be to reconsider or invalidate that variable.
Well, it actually wouldn't invalidate it, but it would force ask the screen.
Okay, so force ask.
Yeah, so it would show the screen and it wouldn't let the user continue until they went past the screen.
Okay.
So that's one way to do it. And I didn't have time to get into it, but if you look at the documentation for the force ask function, it actually does a lot of different things. You can set up like a whole series of questions to be force asked. So like in the comment Michelle made about like reconsidering the income, you could set it up so that if you clicked a button, it would ask one question, and then it would ask another, and it could even ask questions conditionally. And so you can sort of force a flow to be followed, even though the underlying variables might already be defined, which solves the problem of Docacon. So Docacon is powerful because it's kind of based on satisfying dependencies. Like if
Thank you so much.
If the world is unknown, you can just have it answer it or ask all the right questions. But what if the variable's already defined? Well, then it doesn't have the undefinedness to like guide it in what questions to ask. But you can use force ask to do that manually. So that's something to look into. But we are over time, so I want to let you all go. And thank you very much for attending. I also want to plug the session that's taking place in an hour, which is just a sort of screen share your creation presentation, and we're going to have some announcements. So this is just the advanced group here, but that should hopefully be a wide audience. If you have more questions, you hit me up on Slack, but I will let you all go. So thanks very much.
Great job, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.